Easy now, easy!
Here is the full translation, keeping the cinematic, dramatic, and Western tone of your original text. The whole town stood there under the scorching July sun, watching the woman who had just stepped off the stagecoach with cold eyes and mocking whispers. "That ain't what I sent for," the man who had promised to marry her stated callously in front of dozens of people, leaving Abigail Harper rooted to the dirt street with a heavy bag in her hand and a mere $43 in her purse. They looked her up and down with the most contemptuous, cruel, and cheapening glare. They thought a woman publicly rejected for her looks, treated as surplus goods in this wild frontier, would break down in tears of humiliation. But they were wrong. In that moment of absolute isolation, pushed to the brink, a mountain man with blue-gray eyes like the Missouri River in October stepped out from the shadows. He didn't look at her with false pity. He didn't offer meaningless, sweet words. He merely touched the brim of his hat, stepped forward, and spoke in a deep, steady voice amidst the breathless crowd. "I've got a spare room. I'm not offering you charity. If you're willing to work for your keep, I'd consider it a fair trade." From the moment she stepped through the door of that fire-lit cabin, Abigail had no idea her life was about to turn into a chapter far more fierce and miraculous. She was no weak victim waiting to be saved. With her sharp intellect, a meticulously detailed financial ledger, and a terrifying patience, she systematically unraveled dirty plots, exposed the profiteers, and single-handedly seized justice in a land that showed no mercy to the weak. And the man the town had once deemed a loner chose to stand firmly behind her, silently protecting her with actions instead of words. He helped transform her from a rejected outcast into a nexus of power that made even her former mockers tremble and bow their heads. Those who once laughed at her would pay a steep price for their cruelty. And you? Are you ready to follow this story to the very end, to witness the moment justice is served to the one who truly deserves it? Subscribe to the channel right now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single chapter of this breathtaking journey of revenge and awakening. Leave the name of your city in the comments below so I know how far this story has reached. And now, let's return to that Kansas street on that fateful day. Watch as humiliation is crushed into dust. The stagecoach from Dodge City pulled into Harlan Creek just past noon on a Tuesday in July of 1886, and the heat was the kind that made the air itself feel dishonest, shimmering and bent, promising shade that wasn't there. Abigail Harper was the last passenger to step down. She was 32 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches tall, and had spent the better part of her adult life being made to feel like an apology. She wore a blue traveling dress she had sewn herself, let out twice across the bodice because the seamstress in St. Louis had looked at her with thinly veiled pity when she had asked for help. Her dark hair was pinned neat beneath a bonnet that had survived 3 days of dust and rocking, and the particular indignity of a man across the coach who had asked loud enough for everyone to hear whether the driver had been told there would be extra weight on this run. She had not answered him. She had looked out the window at the passing prairie and breathed through her nose, telling herself what she had been telling herself for the last 6 months. Ever since she had first read the advertisement in the St. Louis Courier-Democrat, folded small and tucked into her coat pocket until the paper had gone soft along the creases. Widowed rancher, Western Kansas, seeks companionable wife for partnership and honest living. children in household, comfort of home guaranteed, character valued above all, character valued above all. She had read those 4 words so many times they had become a kind of prayer. Thomas Reed had replied to her letter within 2 weeks. His reply was plain-spoken and decent. He said he was 44, that he had 2 sons aged 9 and 11, that the ranch was modest but solvent, and that he was looking for a woman with good sense and a willing spirit. He said nothing about what she looked like. She had told him in her letter, not in detail but plainly, that she was a larger woman, that she had never been what men called handsome, but that she was hard-working and capable, and had managed her father's household accounts for 11 years without a single error. He had written back again, saying that sounded fine. She had taken that to mean everything. So she had sold her mother's china, her father's pocket watch, and the small writing desk she had loved since she was a girl. She had paid off the last of her rent, said goodbye to the 2 friends she had left in St. Louis, and climbed into a westbound coach with $43, 1 bag, and a heart so full of stubborn hope it embarrassed her. Now she stepped off that coach into the blinding Kansas noon and felt the town look at her before she could get her bearings. A knot of men outside the general store, 2 women on the boardwalk, a boy perched on a hitching post. Abigail felt the particular weight of collective attention settle onto her shoulders like a yoke. She lifted her chin. She picked up her bag. She looked for Thomas Reed. He wasn't hard to find. He had described himself in his letters: tall, dark-haired, going to gray at the temples, tending to wear a brown hat. He was standing about 20 feet away, arms loose at his sides, watching the coach and watching her step off it. She saw his face change. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the exaggerated grimace of a man performing disgust for an audience. It was subtler and worse than that. A kind of flattening, a withdrawal. The expression of a man who had just realized he had made a mistake and was calculating how to manage the inconvenience of it. He walked toward her anyway, and she gave him credit for that. "Miss Harper," he said. "Mr. Reed." She put out her hand. He shook it briefly, barely. "I'm glad to finally meet you in person. I had a fine journey, mostly." He didn't say anything to that. He looked at her face, at her figure, at the traveling dress she had sewn herself, and something in his expression went from calculation to conclusion. "You didn't mention," he said. Her stomach tightened. "I told you I was a larger woman," she said, keeping her voice even. "In my second letter I was direct about it. I figured that meant—" He stopped, shaking his head once. "It doesn't matter what I figured." He looked around, suddenly aware of the eyes upon them. "Mr. Reed, I'm sorry you came all this way," he said, and then, louder, not because the situation called for volume, but because some men expand when they're uncomfortable, filling more space than they need, as if size in that moment might substitute for decency. "You're not what I expected. I can't marry a woman who's not what I expected." The knot of men outside the general store heard it. One of them laughed, not maliciously exactly, more the reflexive laugh of someone who doesn't know what else to do, but it rippled outward and found friends. Within 10 seconds there were other sounds, and a woman on the boardwalk leaned toward her companion with something cupped in her hand that she was putting into the other woman's ear. Abigail stood in the middle of the street. She did not cry. She had promised herself. She kept her eyes on Thomas Reed and said quietly, "I came here in good faith, Mr. Reed. You have my correspondence. You know that." "I'm sorry," he said again. had the grace to look briefly ashamed, and then walked away. Just walked away. She watched him go. The sun pressed down on the top of her bonnet like a hand. Her bag was heavy in her grip. She had $43. She did not know a single person in this town. The next stage east didn't run until Thursday, which was 2 days from now, and she didn't know what a hotel room cost in a town like Harland Creek, but she suspected $43 might not survive the wait and the return fare both. She became aware, in the specific and terrible way of someone who has just been publicly humiliated, of exactly how many eyes were still on her. She stood very still because movement felt impossible, and because she was beneath everything. A woman who had survived harder mornings than this one, even if she couldn't quite locate that knowledge at the moment. "Ma'am?" The voice came from behind her and to the left, low and unhurried. The kind of voice that didn't need to work to carry itself. She turned. He was leaning against the corner post of the land office, arms folded, hat pushed back slightly on his head in the way of a man who had been standing there a while and hadn't felt the need to announce it. He wasn't watching her the way the others had been. He was watching Thomas Reed's retreating back with an expression that was hard to read. Not anger exactly, not pity exactly, somewhere in the territory between contempt and sorrow. Then he looked at her. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a little older. Sun-darkened face, a rancher's build, not bulked up for show, but the kind of lean, deliberate strength that came from 15 years of genuine labor. His eyes were a steady gray-green that reminded her incongruously of the Missouri River in October. He pushed off the post and walked toward her, not fast, not with the energy of someone trying to be a hero, just directly, as if he had made a decision several minutes ago and was only now getting around to acting on it. He stopped a respectful distance from her and tipped his hat in one clean motion. "Ma'am, my name is Ethan Walker. I've got a ranch about 4 miles northeast of town." He paused. "I heard what that man said to you. I expect most of the street heard it." Abigail's voice came out steadier than she had anticipated. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Walker." He didn't apologize on behalf of the town or explain or editorialize. He just acknowledged it as fact. "I've got a spare room, clean, private. My housekeeper, Mrs. Dolan, sleeps on the premises, so the arrangement would be proper." Another pause, shorter. "I'm not offering you charity. I could use help with the ranch accounts, and I've got no wife to manage the household. If you're willing to work for your keep until you figure out what's next, I'd consider it a fair trade." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. She was not naive. She was 32 years old and had been navigating men's intentions for 20 of those years, and she had developed out of necessity a reasonably accurate instrument for detecting the difference between genuine plainness and dressed-up predation. What she saw in Ethan Walker was plainness, uncomplicated, matter-of-fact decency. "Why?" she asked. He seemed to consider the question seriously. "Because what just happened to you was wrong," he said, "and standing here watching it didn't sit right with me." She almost said something then, some form of gratitude or deflection, but what came out instead was the thing she actually meant. "If I come with you and it turns out you're not what you seem to be, then you leave," he said simply. "Mrs. Dolan will drive you back to town herself if it comes to that. You have my word." She picked up her bag. "All right, Mr. Walker," she said. "I'll come." He nodded, picked up her bag before she could protest, not with any show of chivalry, just practically, the way a person picks up something heavy when they're standing right next to it. She followed him to his wagon without looking back at the street, but she felt it behind her. The looks, the whispers, the particular quality of a small town reassembling its narrative around an unexpected development. And she filed it away in the part of herself that had learned over years of being underestimated to pay attention to who was watching and why. The ride out to the Walker Ranch took the better part of an hour because one of the traces needed tending, and Ethan drove with the easy patience of a man who didn't try to fight a road. He did not fill the silence with unnecessary talk. Abigail appreciated that more than she could have said. The prairies stretched out around them, vast and indifferent, baked gold under the brutal afternoon sun. She sat stiffly in her blue traveling dress, feeling the dust settle into the self-sewn seams, but the rhythmic sway of the wagon began to slowly loosen the tight, humiliating knot in her chest. After about 20 minutes of steady travel, she looked over at his profile, shaded by the brim of his worn brown hat. "You mentioned ranch accounts," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Ethan replied, keeping his eyes on the track ahead. "What kind of records do you keep?" He glanced at her sideways. "Ledger book, monthly. I do it myself, but I'm not." He paused, and she got the impression he was choosing honesty over self-preservation. "I'm not good with the detail of it. I miss things. Last spring, I had a discrepancy of nearly $60 that took me 3 weeks to find." "What was it?" Abigail asked, her mind instinctively shifting into the familiar, calming territory of numbers. "Feed supplier double-charged me for a November delivery, and I didn't catch it until March." "Do you still have his invoices?" she asked quickly. "I have all my invoices, every one going back 6 years. Abigail straightened her posture. "Then he owes you that money." Ethan Walker looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite name. "That's what my brother said. I told him I didn't have time to pursue it." "With proper documentation," Abigail said firmly, the sharp intellect of a dry goods manager rising to the surface, "you could settle it in a single letter." He was quiet for a moment. Then he let out a low sound of acknowledgement in the back of his throat. That was the first real conversation they had. She would remember it later as the moment she understood that this man's silence was not dismissal. It was attention. He was a man who listened with his full self, and then thought about what he had heard before he responded. And that, in her experience, was rarer than silver. The ranch announced itself first through the sound of cattle, low and distant, before the buildings came into view. When they did, Abigail took in the state of it without comment. The house needed paint. The Near Eastern pine fence had a gap she could see from the wagon, and there was a general sense of a place that had been managed rather than tended. It wasn't neglect exactly, but the particular quality of a household where someone was doing their best and not quite reaching it. A heavy-set woman of about 60 came out of the house before the wagon had fully stopped. She had iron-gray hair, a practical apron, and the expression of someone who has seen enough of life to be interested rather than surprised by most things. "This is Mrs. Dolan," Ethan said as he stepped down. "She'll get you settled." "Mister," said Dolan, looked at Abigail with a frank, unhurried appraisal. "You hungry? I've got cold chicken and cornbread from this morning." "I am," Abigail said, feeling the sheer physical exhaustion of the day catching up to her. Thank you. Good. Mrs. Dolan took her heavy bag with the same practical ease Ethan had displayed in town. Come in then. Don't let the screen door hit you. The room she was given was clean and simple, featuring a narrow bed and a single window that looked east over the endless prairie. Abigail sat on the edge of the mattress for exactly 90 seconds. She allowed herself to feel the full, crushing weight of the day, the public humiliation, the fear of having nowhere to go, and the strange, quiet grace of Ethan Walker's plain-spoken offer. And then she stood up, smoothed her dusty blue dress, and went to find the kitchen. She was going to earn her keep. That was not charity, that was a contract. She began that same afternoon. The household accounts were in worse shape than the eastern fence, which was saying something. Abigail spread the heavy ledger book across the kitchen table after supper, when Mrs. Dolan had gone to her room. Ethan had just come in from the evening chores, smelling of horses and cold dust, and poured himself coffee into a battered tin mug. He sat across from her and watched in silence as she went through the records page by page, making small, precise marks in the margins with a wooden pencil she had asked Mrs. Dolan for. After about an hour, the warm light of the oil lamp flickering against the dark timber walls, she looked up. Your feed costs are running about 18% higher than they should for the size of your herd, she said flatly. He wrapped his rough hands around his mug, quiet for a moment. How do you know what they should be running? My father ran a dry goods business for 30 years. I did his accounts from the time I was 14. I know what things cost, and I know what the margin between what things cost and what you're being charged ought to look like. She tapped her pencil against the open page. Your supplier in Dodge, Hartwell & Sons. They've been adjusting their prices without adjusting their invoices. It's subtle. A few cents here, a few cents there. But over 2 years, it adds up to... She ran a quick calculation in her head. Somewhere between $90 and $120. The silence that followed was longer than the other silences. That's a significant sum, Ethan said finally, his voice low. It's theft, Abigail said plainly. Soft theft, the kind that's hard to prove and easy to deny. But theft. Can you prove it with the invoices? Yes, she answered without hesitation. It'll take me a few days to document it properly, but yes. She paused, suddenly highly aware of the stillness of the cabin around them. That's if you want me to. Ethan Walker looked at her across the table with that steady, gray-green regard. She had the odd sensation, unsettling and yet not unpleasant, of being seen without being evaluated, as if his eyes were doing something entirely different than most eyes did when they looked at her frame. I want you to, he said. She nodded, gripped her pencil, and went back to the ledger. She stayed up past midnight that first night, completely absorbed, while the silent rancher kept the kitchen fire alive against the creeping cold, asking nothing more of her than the work she had promised to do. The first week passed entirely in work. Abigail folded her dust-stained blue traveling dress, placed it carefully at the bottom of her heavy bag, and transitioned into a sturdy canvas apron borrowed from Mrs. Dolan. She established herself in the Walker household with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who has never had the luxury of inefficiency. She reorganized the pantry, not because anyone asked her to, but because the current arrangement was costing Mrs. Dolan 20 extra minutes of effort every day. She identified 3 places in the supply ordering system where Ethan was paying redundant delivery fees, correcting them with sharp, precise strokes of her wooden pencil, and she observed. She observed that Ethan's two sons, Marcus, 11, and James, 9, circled her with the careful wariness of children who had learned that new people in their household sometimes didn't stay. Marcus, the older one, was all sharp edges and protective bluster. He watched her from doorways, answered her questions in clipped syllables, and wouldn't touch his plate if she had been the one to set it down. James was different. James was curious in the way of a child who has not yet decided whether curiosity is safe, hovering and retreating in a pattern that would have been almost comical if it hadn't been so plainly genuine. On her third afternoon, Abigail left a piece of fresh cornbread on the kitchen windowsill with a small paper twist of cinnamon sugar dusted over it, having noticed James eyeing the sugar jar earlier. She didn't make a production of it, she just left it there. It was gone 20 minutes later. That evening, as the Kansas sun sank low and painted the timber walls gold, James walked up to the kitchen table and asked her if she knew how to play checkers. "I do," Abigail said, closing her ledger. "Papa taught us," James said softly, "but he always wins." "That's because your papa lets you see his strategy too early," Abigail said, her tone perfectly even. "You keep watching his hands, not the board." James stared at her wide-eyed. "How did you know?" "Because it's the natural thing to do, and it's wrong. You want to play?" They played 3 games at the kitchen table. Ethan watched from the shadowed doorway without announcing himself, his worn hat pushed back on his head. James won the second game, a victory that shocked him so thoroughly he forgot to celebrate for a full minute. From the doorway, Abigail heard a sound that she thought might have been a laugh, quietly converted into a cough. She did not look up, but she filed the sound away in the growing internal record she kept of the moments that told her who Ethan Walker truly was. It was at the end of the second week that she had her first real conversation with Marcus. He found her in the kitchen garden at 6 in the morning, kneeling in the cool dirt with her sleeves pushed up, clearing a stubborn stand of bindweed from the tomato row. She heard his boots behind her but kept working, having learned early that Marcus approached things sideways and didn't respond well to direct confrontation. He stood there for a long time. Then, his voice clipped and defensive. "You're pulling it wrong." Abigail sat back on her heels and looked over her shoulder. Marcus was standing with his arms crossed, the absolute posture of a boy performing indifference. "Am I?" she asked mildly. "If you just pull the vine, it breaks off and the root stays, and it comes back worse. You gotta get the root." "Show me." He blinked. He hadn't expected that. He stayed still for another beat, then stepped forward, crouched in the dirt beside her, and worked his small fingers into the soil at the base of the vine. He excavated carefully, following the root system down until he could get his hand under the whole thing. Then he pulled, a slow, steady resistance, and it came out whole. "See?" He held it up. "That's a good technique," Abigail said, and she meant it. "Where'd you learn that, Mama?" he said. The words slipped out unguarded, hanging in the crisp morning air like a dropped glass. Marcus seemed to realize instantly what he had said, and his young face did something complicated and devastated. Abigail didn't push. She turned her eyes back to her own section of the garden. She had a good garden. A pause. "Yes, ma'am." A longer pause followed. She said the garden was the part of the ranch that was hers. Papa built everything, but the garden was hers. "That makes sense," Abigail said, her voice gentle but completely devoid of pity. "A person needs something that's theirs." She kept working. After a moment, so did Marcus. They weeded in silence for the better part of an hour, the quiet camaraderie of physical labor acting as a bridge where words would have failed. When Mrs. Dolan finally called them in for breakfast, Marcus stepped ahead and held the heavy wooden gate open for Abigail without being asked. She didn't make a fuss over it, but as she walked past the boy, she felt the unmistakable shift in the air. She was building something here. It wasn't just a balanced ledger or a weeded garden, but even as the quiet warmth of the house began to settle around her shoulders, the heavily documented letter she had drafted to Hartwell and Sons was traveling east, and she knew the silence of the frontier would not last indefinitely. The reply from the Hartwell and Sons company arrived in the third week. Ethan read it at the breakfast table, his expression not changing much, though Abigail noticed a subtle tightening in the set of his jaw. "They're denying it," he said, his voice flat. "I expected that," Abigail said, setting down her coffee. "May I see?" He passed the letter across the rough wood of the table. She read it quickly, her dark eyes tracking the typed lines. The language was evasive in the specific, slippery way of men who know they've been caught and are testing whether the person who caught them has the stamina to follow through. "They're hoping you'll drop it," she said, looking back up at him. "I figured." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "You won't." She met his gray-green eyes squarely. "No, I won't." "Good. Then you'll need to file a formal complaint with the Dodge City Merchants Board." "I'll draft it today," Abigail said immediately, the procedural steps already organizing themselves in her mind. "I'll need you to sign it, and we'll need copies of every invoice going back to January of '84. I have them. Then we'll be fine." Ethan kept looking at her for a moment, the morning light catching the gray at his temples. "You've done this kind of thing before." "My father had a supplier problem in 1879, she said, the memory tightening her chest briefly. "Not the same situation, but similar mechanics. The solution was documentation. It usually is." "And you solved it." "My father solved it. I helped him build the case." "How old were you?" 25. Ethan Walker sat in silence for a moment, his gaze steady and unreadable. Then he said, "He must have been grateful to have you." It was the simplest kind of statement, plain as the worn table between them, but something in it, the matter-of-fact quality of it, the ease with which he assumed that a man being grateful to have her around was the only natural conclusion, struck Abigail somewhere tender and totally unexpected. She had to look down at the letter to hide the sudden, sharp burning behind her eyes. "He was," she said carefully. "He was a good man. When he passed, he left me the house, but the debts were—" She stopped. She hadn't meant to say that much. The vulnerability of her past was not something she offered freely. "It was a difficult time, and you ended up answering an advertisement in a newspaper," Ethan said, not unkindly, but with his trademark plainness. "Yes." He nodded once. "The man who placed it was a foo." Abigail felt the corner of her mouth do something it hadn't done in several weeks. "So am I." He picked up his coffee. She went back to the Hartwell correspondence, and the kitchen filled with the warm, ordinary sounds of Mrs. Dolan moving efficiently between the stove and the counter, and James arguing from the next room that he was absolutely sure he had washed his hands. Abigail thought, with a kind of bewildered gratitude she didn't entirely trust, "This is what a home sounds like." 6 weeks later, the Merchants' Board in Dodge City ruled entirely in Ethan's favor. Hartwell and Sons was ordered to remit the overcharge with a 10% penalty interest. The final figure came out to $117. Word traveled as it does in small, isolated places, and it traveled with a particular quality of surprise. It wasn't just that justice had been done, it was that a woman had come to a stranger's house and executed it quietly, ruthlessly, and without fanfare, all in between weeding the vegetable garden and teaching the younger boy how to play checkers. People in Harlan Creek began to talk about the Walker Ranch in the same tone they used for things that had turned around when no one was quite looking. The eastern fences were finally getting fixed. The accounts were undeniably sound. The house had wild prairie flowers in the front window for the first time in years. Ethan Walker, who had always been well regarded but quietly assumed to be in a slow, grieving decline, was suddenly a man whose operation neighboring ranchers were watching with profound respect. And the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach only to be rejected in the public dirt, the woman who had gone home with a stranger instead of weeping, was the quiet, undeniable fact at the center of all of it. Abigail was intensely aware of this shift, but she was also aware, with the careful, watchful attention she'd been exercising since that first night with the ledger, that something else was changing. Something that had nothing to do with balance sheets or fence repairs. Ethan had begun finding reasons to be near the house in the evenings, where he had previously stayed out in the barn or the far pasture until dark. He now came in while the light was still good. He would linger in the kitchen doorway or sit at the yard table where she did the accounts, pouring himself coffee from his battered tin mug and staying just to listen to her breathe in the quiet space between them. He never said anything that crossed a line. Neither did she. But she felt the pull of it, building wordless and patient. It frightened her, because underneath the fear was something she didn't have a better name for than hope. What she did not know, as the Kansas summer pressed on, was that Thomas Reed had also heard about the Hartwell ruling. He had heard about the Walker Ranch's resurgence, and he was thinking in the particular, calculating way of men who only understand value when someone else has publicly demonstrated it, that perhaps he had been hot. On Saturday, Harlan Creek held its monthly market day in the square, and Ethan loaded the wagon with supplies Mrs. Dolan needed, telling the boys they could come if they finished their chores before 9. He said it to Abigail without quite looking at her, offering her a chance to see the town again. She understood the subtext. The town had seen her arrive humiliated, and he was offering her a chance to be seen differently. "All right," she said. Marcus sat beside her in the wagon on the way in, which was itself unexpected. About a mile outside of town, the 11-year-old boy abruptly warned her that people were going to look at her because of what happened when she first arrived. Abigail answered honestly, telling him that while it used to bother her a great deal, finding something she was genuinely good at meant she spent less time worrying about the opinions of strangers. Marcus absorbed this in silence, but when they pulled into the market square and a woman near the dry goods store cut a quick look at Abigail, Marcus straightened up beside her with the absolute posture of a boy who has decided he is escorting someone and the town should know it. The morning went smoothly. People were curious, but Ethan moved through the market with the ease of a man who belonged there, introducing her simply as Miss Harper, who had been helping run the ranch. The lack of apology or explanation in his tone did more for her dignity than any speech could have. She were heading back to the wagon past the stage stop when she saw him. Thomas Reed was standing outside the hotel. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, and she watched the sequence of expressions cross his face: recognition, discomfort, and then a calculating shift that made her stomach tighten. He walked toward her. Ethan was at the wagon, his back to the street, helping load a crate. The boys were beside her. She could have angled away, but she stood her ground. "Miss Harper," Thomas said, pulling his hat off, more courtesy than he had shown her on the day they met. "I was hoping I might see you in town." "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice level, "I've been hearing things about the Walker Ranch. Good things. I heard about the Hartwell business. That took real ability." He turned his hat in his hands. "I wanted to say that I perhaps reacted too quickly when you arrived." Marcus, standing at her elbow, went very still. Abigail looked at Thomas Reed for a long moment. She thought about what she had felt standing on that street in the July sun, with her bag in her hand and the sound of laughter moving through the crowd. She thought about the $43 and what it had cost her to stay. "You said I wasn't what you expected," she said. "I believe that was accurate." Thomas shifted, looking for an open. "I was wondering whether you might consider, whether we might have supper and talk about—" "No," she said. Simple, complete. No hedging or softening. Thomas looked briefly startled. "I appreciate that you came to say this," Abigail continued coldly. "But I am employed, and I am settled, and I don't believe supper would serve either of us." She inclined her head and walked past him to the wagon, where Ethan had turned around and was watching the street with an expression she couldn't entirely read. He helped her up without a word. They were out of town and onto the road home before Ethan spoke. "That was Thomas Reed." "Yes." "What did he want?" "To apologize. And then, after the apology, to have supper." She felt the shift in Ethan beside her, a quick, controlled tightening. "What did you tell him?" "I told him no." Ethan kept his eyes on the track ahead, but the set of his shoulders changed. "Why?" "Because he saw what I could do and changed his mind," Abigail said, staring at the dusty road. "And a man who changes his mind about a woman the moment she becomes useful, that's not a man who sees her. That's a man who's revised his inventory." Ethan said nothing for a long moment. "That's well put." Another silence followed, before he added quietly, "He's a fool." "He's ordinary," Abigail said. "That might be worse." Thomas Reed, however, did not accept the refusal quietly. He began talking, not loudly, not cruelly, but consistently, and with the quiet persistence of a man who understood how small towns worked. He started suggesting that Abigail was merely a capable woman in a dependent situation, that it was natural for a widower to benefit from her presence, and that she might be confusing basic decency and gratitude for something else. He insinuated she was a woman with limited options who was misreading her place. Abigail heard the rumors by Wednesday. She stood in the middle of the kitchen for 45 seconds with absolutely still hands. And then she sat down at the table, opened the ledger, and worked for the rest of the afternoon, with the focused intensity of a woman using productivity as a container for her fury. She did not tell Ethan about the rumors. She did not need to. Mrs. Dolan had heard the talk from the blacksmith's wife and had already spent 2 days in a state of contained fury, producing the best bread she had baked since Abigail arrived. Mrs. Dolan had also spoken to Ethan, bluntly warning him that Thomas Reed was spreading poison and that Ethan needed to stop hoping Abigail would figure out his feelings simply by the quality of his silence. It was 3 days later that Ethan found Abigail in the kitchen at 5 in the morning. She hadn't been able to sleep. The ledgers were finished, leaving her brain nothing practical to work on, which meant it had spent the dark hours working on Thomas Reed's insinuations. She was sitting at the table, staring at nothing, when Ethan appeared in the doorway in his work clothes, his worn brown hat in his hand. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." He came in, poured himself coffee into his battered tin mug, and sat down across from her, which was habit by now. But his face was different this morning, more open, as if the night had dissolved some of his careful management. "Bad thoughts?" he asked. "Complicated ones," she said. He wrapped his rough hands around the mug, looking at her with that steady gray-green regard. "Tell me." She almost deflected, relying on the long-practiced reflex of a woman used to hiding her interior life. But this was Ethan Walker, who listened with his full self. "I keep thinking," she said slowly, "that I have no idea what I'm building here. I came here because a man promised me a home and a life and a beginning. That didn't happen. What happened instead has been good, better than I'd planned for in most of the ways that matter. But I don't know what it is, and I'm not good at not knowing what things are." The silence stretched in the timber-walled room. Then Ethan said, "What would you want it to be, if you could choose?" She looked up at him. "I don't know how to answer that without saying something that changes things." "Maybe things should change," he said, and Abigail's heart did something rapid and complicated. He set down his coffee mug. "I'm going to say something plainly, because I've spent 3 years being careful, and I've mostly found that careful is another word for lonely." Abigail went very still. "I don't know what this is either," Ethan said, his voice low and incredibly grounded. "But I know that this house is different than it was in June. I know my boys are different. I know that I sit at this table every evening because it's where you are, and I hadn't done that. Sat with someone, just sat with someone since Eleanor died." He met her eyes directly. "I'm not saying that to make you feel obligated. I'm saying it because you said you were trying to be honest, and I reckon I owe you the same." Abigail heard her own pulse drumming in the quiet room. "I'm frightened," she said finally. "I know I was wrong before about a man. I don't want to be someone who mistakes gratitude for something else. And I don't want you to, Abigail." His voice was quiet and absolutely firm. "I've been grateful to a lot of people in my life. I don't sit in the kitchen until midnight because I'm grateful." She looked at him for a long moment. The oil lamp burned between them, casting long shadows against the walls. Outside, the Kansas morning was still dark and brutally cold. "I'm not ready to know what this is," she said at last, needing to protect the fragile thing growing between them. "All right," he said, "but I don't want to not say." She stopped, gathered herself, finding her dignity. "I don't want to not say that I'm glad I came here, that I'm glad it was you who stepped forward on that street." Something moved across Ethan Walker's face that she thought she might spend a long time remembering. Not elation exactly, but something quieter and more certain than that. "So am I," he said. He picked up his coffee, finished it, put his hat back on, and went out to the morning chores. Abigail sat at the kitchen table in the pre-dawn quiet, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, feeling something precarious and enormous filling the space behind her ribs. She was in considerable trouble, she realized, and she didn't want a way out. But Thomas Reed was not finished, and the trouble was about to take a shape neither of them had anticipated. The peace of the late summer was broken on a Wednesday. Ethan came in from town with a face Abigail hadn't seen on him before, controlled and cold in a way that went deeper than his usual quiet. He walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table without taking off his worn brown hat, which he never did. That alone told her the severity of the situation. "What happened?" she said, setting her pencil down. He put a folded paper on the table in front of her. She picked it up and read it quickly, her eyes scanning the dense legal language. It was a notice posted that morning at the Harlan Creek Land Office by T.H. Thomas Reed. He was citing a claim that a portion of the Walker Ranch's eastern water access ran through land that Reed claimed had been improperly registered. He was filing for a review of the original deed. Abigail understood the frontier implications immediately. If the claim had any traction, it would freeze the ranch's operating water rights for the duration of the review, which could take months. For a working cattle operation in Kansas, months without guaranteed water access was not an inconvenience. It was absolute ruin. She read it twice. Her hands were perfectly steady. "How solid is your original deed?" "Solid," Ethan said. "My father filed it in 1871. The records are at the county seat. Are there any irregularities, any gaps in the chain of filing?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "There is one transfer in 1878 when my father conveyed the eastern section to me directly. The county recorder at the time he was not a careful man. The documentation it may not be complete." Abigail felt the shape of the problem with the specific precision of someone who had spent her life thinking in margins and ledgers. Thomas Reed had not found a genuine legal weakness. He had found a place where the record was thin, and he was going to press on it hard enough that the pressure itself would cause damage, even if the underlying claim was ultimately false. It was a sophisticated attack for a man like Reed, which meant he was likely paying someone on the inside, a corrupt deputy commissioner like Gerald Potts, to force it through. "I need to see everything," she said. "Every land document you have, the original deed, the 1878 transfer, every survey, every tax record. I need it tonight." Ethan looked at her. The shadows in the kitchen seemed to press in closer. "Abigail, this is solvable," she interrupted, cutting off the creeping edge of despair in his voice. She said it not because she was certain yet, but because Ethan's face had something in it that was close to the look of a man who is beginning to believe he might lose his home, and she was not going to let that take root. "This is the kind of thing I know how to do. Let me look at it before either of us decide how worried to be." He looked at her for a moment. Then he got up and went to the study, pulling heavy document boxes from the high shelves. She rolled up her sleeves and went to help. They worked until 2 in the morning. Mrs. Dolan brought them fresh coffee at 10 o'clock, looked at the sea of papers spread across the table, asked if it was bad, and upon hearing Ethan say he wasn't sure yet, simply nodded and went to brew more. The 1878 transfer was indeed imperfect. The county recorder had used a non-standard form. The witness signatures were incomplete, and there was a period of 6 weeks during which, on paper, the ownership of the eastern parcel was technically ambiguous. 6 weeks was enough for a corrupt commissioner to freeze the water. But there was something else. At midnight, Abigail found it folded into a property tax receipt she would have missed if she hadn't been going through everything with her usual systematic ruthlessness. She unfolded it, smoothed the fragile edges, and read it twice. "Ethan," she said. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot from the lamplight. She pushed the document across the table. "The water access Thomas is contesting, the Eastern Stream. This survey from 1874 establishes the water boundary based on a natural marker, a specific rock formation." She pointed to the faded notation in the surveyor's handwriting. "Do you know where this is?" Ethan studied it. His exhausted face changed, sharpening. "Yes, I know exactly where it is. Saddle Rock." "Is it still there?" "It's still there. I've ridden past it 100 times. Abigail leaned forward, tapping the paper. "Then the water boundary was established before the 1878 transfer, under your father's original deed. The transfer of the eastern parcel was a conveyance of land, not of the water rights, which were separately recorded in 1874. Thomas Reed's claim is based on the assumption that the water rights were part of the 1878 transfer, but they weren't. He's attacking the wrong document." Ethan looked at the 1874 survey, and then he looked at her. The silence in the kitchen was as absolute. "Can you prove that?" he asked, his voice rough. "By tomorrow afternoon," she said. "I can write something that will make it plain to any land commissioner in Kansas." Ethan sat back in his chair. Something moved through his face, relief, and something harder to name, something that looked like awe without the performance of it. "Abigail, don't thank me yet," she said, picking up her pencil. "Let me finish the work." He didn't speak, but she felt his eyes on her for a long moment before he went back to his own stack of papers. It was a look she filed carefully in the place where she kept things that were still too important to look at directly. They worked side by side in the lamplight until the case was built, clear, documented, and unarguable. Outside, the Kansas night held everything in its enormous, indifferent quiet. But inside the timber walls, Abigail Harper knew exactly what she was worth. The confrontation with Gerald Potts the next day was swift and clinical. When Potts attempted to present a newly forged deposition from the elderly 1874 surveyor Frank Aldis, claiming the marker was a mistake, Abigail immediately identified the illegible witness signatures and demanded a medical verification of the 73-year-old man's condition. Potts, recognizing a woman who understood legal procedure better than he did, backed down and halted the freeze. They found Frank Aldis the following afternoon in a rooming house in Creede, 12 miles east. He was frail and confused, but his memory of Saddle Rock was absolute. He admitted a man had brought him a paper disguised as a routine clarification and hadn't let him read it. Abigail drafted a sworn witness statement right there in the room, proving Aldis had been misled and that his original 1874 survey stood as recorded. On the long wagon ride home, Ethan Walker finally asked her to marry him. He did it without kneeling, without a grand speech, simply telling her that she had saved his ranch, that she had brought his boys back to life, and that he didn't want to keep leaving what they had unnamed. Abigail, exhausted and deeply happy, looked at this man with his gray-green eyes and told him to ask her again when they weren't in a moving vehicle, and he wasn't still angry at corrupt land commissioners. The true reckoning came on a Sunday, 3 weeks later, at the Harlan Creek Church social. Thomas Reed, cornered by the total collapse of his legal trap and the state investigation Abigail had triggered by mailing copies of the fraud to Topeka, made one final desperate social calculation. He walked into the center of the gathering, where Ethan and Abigail were standing together, and loudly accused Abigail of trying to destroy his reputation out of spite. "You came here as nobody," Reed sneered, trying to rally the crowd. "You came here as a woman I turned away, and you spent 4 months turning a man's sympathy into—" "Go ahead," Abigail interrupted, her voice entirely even. "Finish it." The crowd went dead silent. Ethan moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with her. Marcus, stepping up to his father's side, folded his arms in an exact, fiercely protective mirror of Ethan's posture. "You chose a public venue," Abigail said, her dark eyes pinning Reed in place. "So did I, the first time, when you finished your sentence in front of 40 people and walked away. I didn't have a choice about that audience. You've chosen this one. Finish your sentence." Thomas Reed looked around. He saw the townsfolk, ranchers who respected Ethan, women who had begun seeking Abigail's financial advice, the Reverend's wife, the general store owner. He saw Ethan Walker standing like a wall of stone. Reed did not finish his sentence. "I came here with a bag and $43, Abigail told him, her voice ringing clear in the crisp air. "I don't blame you for the decision you made that day. I blame you for using what happened afterward, what this family built, as material for the kind of legal maneuvering that puts an elderly man's signature on a document he wasn't read. That's what I filed a complaint about, not your opinion of me, your conduct." Thomas Reed muttered a stifled retrie, and left the social. By Wednesday, he had packed his bags, settled his hotel bill, and ridden out of Harlan Creek for good. The wedding was set for the second Saturday of November. The Kansas sky was a hard, bright blue, carrying the first real, honest edge of winter. Abigail wore a beautiful ivory wool dress, crafted with the help of Clara Voss, the school teacher who had apologized for ever listening to Reed's rumors. The church was filled with 40 people. Not the 40 people who had laughed at her in July, but the 40 people she and Ethan had chosen as their true community. Marcus walked her down the aisle, rigid with a dignified pride he had secretly craved. James delivered a 4-sentence speech. He said he was scared at first. He said he changed his mind over a checkers game. He said she taught him to read the stars. And he said he was glad she had stayed, because if she hadn't, his father would have kept doing the jaw-clenching thing indefinitely, and it was very distracting. The church laughed. Ethan made a sound that was specific and involuntary. Abigail gave up on composure and let the warm, real tears fall. When Ethan took her hand to say his vows, there was no performance. There was just the steady, unhurried certainty of his rough hands holding hers. He looked at her and saw exactly what she was: a woman of immense worth, sharp intellect, and unyielding strength. Late that night, after the guests had gone and the boys were asleep, Ethan found her sitting at the yard table under the vast canopy of November stars. He sat down beside her, not across from her, but right beside her, and took her hand. She leaned her head against his shoulder, letting her weight settle completely against the silent man who had stepped out of the dust to offer her a job, and had ended up giving her the only safe place left in the world. She had not needed to become smaller to be loved. She'd only needed to find a man strong enough to stand beside her. Remember, the pain of rejection does not define your worth. Rather, the way you rise and rebuild your world from the ashes serves as the most resounding answer. A true home never asks you to whittle yourself down to fit in. It simply opens its doors and keeps the fire burning, waiting for you to step inside.